Hi everyone, thanks for joining. My name is Tiffany and today I'm going to tell you a story about one of California's most notorious criminals. And while I tell the story, I'm also going to be sketching him. I tried a little bit of the multitasking where I actually sketch while I talk, and it's a little bit difficult. So I'm going to have a video up in the corner of me sketching him while I tell you the story. So the story is about Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., and he went by many monikers: the Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist, the Visalia Ransacker, the original Night Stalker. He's responsible for over 120 burglaries, over 50 sexual assaults, and at least 13 murders that we know of. So Joseph was born on November 8th, 1945 in Bath, New York. His father was Joseph James DeAngelo Sr., and his mother was Kathleen DeGroat, who also went by Kay. He had 3 siblings: an older sister, Rebecca, a younger sister, Connie or Constance, and a younger brother, John. So Joseph's father was in the Air Force, and they moved around a lot on bases, mainly in Germany, when he was a child. And when Joseph was just 9 years old, he witnessed the horrible sexual assault of his younger sister by 2 airmen while they were playing in an abandoned warehouse on one of the Air Force bases. This must have been extremely traumatizing for Joseph. I can't imagine being the older sibling and feeling like you need to protect your sister and not being able to do anything about it. So that may be one of the most traumatizing things that Joseph experienced throughout his childhood that we know of. I did some research and had a really hard time finding anything regarding neglect, trauma, abuse. There was some stuff about his father being a little bit stern, but I didn't see anything about abuse or anything like that, other than the traumatic event that he experienced with his little sister. So at some point in his childhood, the family moved to California, and then Joseph's father was later stationed in Korea, and the family stayed behind while he went to Korea. And during that time, at some point, his mother met a traveling welder who was also married with children. Go figure. And she began seeing this traveling welder and would later marry this man. The family moved to Auburn, California, and I'm not really sure or clear what year or how old exactly Joseph was, but from what I read and gathered in my research, he was somewhere in his teens. But Joseph attended middle school in Rancho Cordova, California, which is kind of a suburb of Sacramento, California. And he went to Folsom High School in 1961 and either graduated or received a GED somewhere around 1963 to 1964. In 1964, Joseph enlisted in the Navy and was in the Navy until 1968. In 1968, Joseph enrolled in Sierra College in Rockland, California, and spent a few years there earning an associate's degree in police science, and then went on from there to Sacramento State to obtain a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. While attending Sierra College, Joseph met a young lady 5 years his junior named Bonnie. And Bonnie struck his eye, and he pursued her and eventually gained her attention, and they began dating. They dated for a few years, and at one point he basically put a ring on her finger and said, we're engaged, and they had planned to be married. Bonnie said that Joseph was kind of a risk taker, a rule breaker. He would ride his motorcycle at high speeds, doing things that terrified her while she was riding on the back. He would hunt without a hunting license, fish without a fishing license, little things like that. And at one point in their relationship, Joseph came to Bonnie and wanted her to cheat for him for one of his exams. And Bonnie was absolutely against this and told him that she would not cheat. A few weeks later, Bonnie, after stewing on it, I guess, and realizing that there was just too many things about Joseph that she couldn't see spending her life with him, she decided to break off the engagement. So she broke off the engagement, and then one night she woke up to Joseph at her window. He had a gun and pointed the gun at her and basically told her, get dressed, come with me, we're going to Reno and you're gonna marry me now. So Bonnie was terrified, of course. She obviously knew that Joseph had these little things about him, that he would break the rules and kind of bend the law, but I don't think that she ever anticipated that this was one of his characteristics. So frightened, she went to her father, woke him up, and her father told her to go into the house and she would take care of it. So Bonnie's father went outside. Nobody knows what he said to Joseph or what really took place, but according to Bonnie, it was quite some time that they were outside while she was inside, terrified, obviously, wondering what was being said, what was being done. After some time of being out there, Bonnie's father came inside the house and told her, I handled it, go to bed. After graduating Sac State in 1972, Joseph interned at the Roseville, California Police Department for, I believe, a year and a half. And then he went on to become a police officer for Exeter, California Police Department. He was hired there in May of 1973 and would work in the burglary unit as a police officer till 1976. At some point in the 3-year career at the Exeter Police Department, Joseph was promoted to sergeant. Joseph met Sharon, and in 1973, he also married Sharon in a church in the little town of Auburn, California. And later they would go on to have 3 children. From 1974 to 1976, the residents of Visalia, California, dealt with what they called the Visalia Ransacker. And this individual, who we later would learn would be Joseph DeAngelo, broke in and burglarized over 100 homes. Weird thing about this is that when Joseph would break into these homes, he wouldn't steal things of value. He wouldn't take expensive jewelry or money or electronics even. Instead, he would rummage through maybe their underwear drawer. He would take one earring and leave the other of the set. He would take a family photograph, just weird, bizarre shit. I think, to me, that makes it a little bit creepier. Somebody breaking in for to steal something of value. But while breaking into and burglarizing these homes, sometimes Joseph would open up the refrigerator and grab a beer and then drink a beer. He would eat snacks, sometimes eat their ice cream. It was almost like he was taunting to show that he was in control. I can take my time and I can do whatever I want. In September of 1975, in the midst of all the Visalia ransackings, Joseph attempted to kidnap a 16-year-old girl named Elizabeth. She woke up at 2 a.m. with an unknown man standing over her with a ski mask and telling her, I'm taking you, and if you make a noise, I'm going to kill you. So somewhere along the line, Elizabeth, the 16-year-old, was able to make her father aware of this individual who had broken into the house, and her father, Claude, attempted to stop Joseph from taking her daughter and was shot and killed. This would be the first known homicide that Joseph committed. He shot Claude, Elizabeth's father, right in front of her twice. And then he physically assaulted her and took off. A few months later in December, Detective Bill Mcgowan, who was part of the task force for the Visalia Ransacker, had responded to a call of a possible prowler. And when he responded, he came upon who we now know is Joseph. The bizarre thing about this situation is that Joseph, from what the detective said, flashed the light in his eyes to attempt to blind him and screamed like a girl. He said that he screamed really high pitch and very loud, and it was something that stuck out that years and years later, when being questioned or interviewed, he still can't get over the sound or the high-pitched scream that Joseph made. But in an attempt to get away, Joseph shot at the detective. Luckily, he was not killed. Joseph hit him with the bullet Joseph shot, hit, I believe, his flashlight, causing shrapnel to, cut up his face, his eye. But luckily for the detective, he lived, and so he would not be the second homicide victim of this monster. In August of 1976, Joseph DeAngelo was hired by the Auburn, California Police Department. He would spend the next 3 years as an Auburn police officer. But in October of 1979, the chief of police was notified that one of their officers had been arrested for attempting to steal dog repellent and a hammer at a local store. And the chief made the decision to fire Joseph. Unbeknownst to Auburn Police Department's chief or any other members of the police department, Joseph had begun the crimes that would earn him the moniker of the East Area Rapist. So in June of 1976, a 22-year-old woman woke up to an unknown man in her bedroom doorway wearing a ski mask. He approached her with a knife, held it to her throat, tied her up, and proceeded to sexually assault her. This would be the first known East Area Rapist victim. So in May of 1977, a 22-year-old female and her husband were woken by a man wearing a ski mask who informed them that he had a gun. Joseph had the female tie up the male, and then he tied the female up. He then proceeded to rummage through their house, go into their refrigerator, kind of like the Visalia incidences, drink a beer, take his time, leave them there, terrified, wondering, what the fuck is going on. Then Joseph put dishes on the male's back. And he told the male, if I hear these dishes move, I will cut her ear off. He blindfolded the female and proceeded to rape her with a knife held to her throat. Piece of shit. In June of 1976, another 22-year-old female in the Sacramento area woke to a man standing in her doorway wearing a ski mask. He held a knife to her throat, tied her up with fabric and a cord, and proceeded to sexually assault her. In July of that year, Joseph broke into the home where two sisters aged 15 and 16 were and tied both of them up, sexually assaulted them, and hit them over the head. In December, he broke into a home where a 15-year-old female was playing the piano. He put a knife to her throat, escorted her to the backyard, sexually assaulted her, then brought her back inside, did the same, and then took her back outside and assaulted her again. These are just a few of the many, many, like I said, over 50 sexual assaults committed by Joseph DeAngelo under the moniker the East Area Rapist. And this would go on for around 3 years, from 1976 to 1979. One thing that Joseph also did during this time is taunted his victims. He would make phone calls to them, and at one point the police officers decided to, tap or record incoming phone calls. In 1977, he called the police department, or they think it was him calling the police department, and stating that he was the East Area Rapist and said, "You're never going to catch me." In 1978, a phone call was recorded from Joseph to one of his victims where he said, gonna kill you, several times, and then proceeded to call her a bitch and a fucking whore. These are other examples of what I think is him trying to exert control and fear. He wanted them to be scared. He wanted to instill fear in them even after the fact. It's also believed that he stalked his victims prior to assaulting them. Some even believe that he broke into their homes and kind of cased the place. He would walk areas like behind the houses, along the path of a canal or something like that, to kind of get an idea of, I guess, easy targets, people that he felt he could get away with assaulting. He would also, or they believe he would also do this to get an understanding of schedules and things like that. After that, he would go on to commit the assaults that included a male in the home, husband, boyfriend, and there are many, many of those. And those were the cases where he would often put dishes on the male's back and threaten to either hurt him or the female if he heard the dishes move in the other room. And his assaults lasted sometimes for hours. And like I said before, he would rumble through the house and look through people's things and eat ice cream out of the freezer, drink a beer. I mean, just so nonchalant, like, you can't catch me, I guess. Some of the victims also stated that one unique thing about him was that he would speak through clenched teeth, and he kind of mumbled when he would speak. At this point, the sexual assaults in the Sacramento and surrounding areas stopped, and in February of 1978, down in Southern California, the crimes that would earn Joseph the name Golden State Killer began. Brian and Katie Maggiore, 21 and 20 years old, a newlywed couple, were out walking their dog. It's a little unclear as to how the events unfolded that evening. Somebody saw them running, but ultimately both ended up getting shot in a nearby neighbor's yard. Some time went by after this before the next murders took place. In December of 1979, Dr. Robert Offman and his girlfriend, Deborah Alexander, were shot to death in his condo in Southern California. Both were found on their waterbed with their wrists bound behind their back, where Robert had been shot 3 times in the back and the chest, and Deborah had been shot in the head. In March the following year, in Ventura, California, Charlene and Lyman Smith were found murdered in their home. Charlene had been bound and sexually assaulted, and Joseph beat them to death with a log. It is said from some of the research that I did that the crime scene was just unbelievable. It was terrible. Not that any of the other crime scenes were not terrible, but for some reason, this crime scene stood out to many. Then in August, Joseph killed Patricia and Keith Harrington in Laguna Niguel. Well, I don't know if I'm saying that right. California, which is in Southern California. And again, she was bound and sexually assaulted, and they both had been bludgeoned with a blunt object. In February of 1981, 21-year-old Manuela Whithun, I don't know if I'm saying that right either, was the next to fall victim to Joseph DeAngelo, and she was also sexually assaulted and bludgeoned to death. This took place in Irvine, California, also in Southern California region. In July of 81, the next murders would take place in Goleta, California. Sherry Domingo was house sitting for her aunt, and her friend, or maybe boyfriend, Gregory Sanchez, was accompanying her, and they were both murdered. She was bludgeoned to death with a blunt object, and he was shot to death. After the murders of Sherry and Gregory, close to 5 years went by before another murder took place that was connected to Joseph DeAngelo. A lot of people have different speculations as to why the gap, or such a long gap, considering for so many years, I know he started out with, minor crimes, the Visalia ransackings, and then escalated to sexual assaulting over 50 women, many of them with their husbands or boyfriends in the home who also were victims, and then escalated to, seeking out people to murder them. But it's unsure why he went for 5 years without another homicide, considering the rest of the crimes were all so close together. There was never a year or 2 or 5 in between his god-awful shit crimes. But when I did research, I found that Joseph's first daughter was born in September of 1981. The last murder before the hiatus was in July of 1981, just 2 months before she was born. So I kind of wonder if maybe he was playing dad and took the hiatus to, quote unquote, take care of his family. And I could be wrong, but I know from a lot of the stuff that I've read over the years, for people like Joseph, serial killers, they tend to commit more of their crimes when they're under a lot of stress, or there's a huge event taking place in their life, a death, a divorce, a job loss, things like that. And so it would make sense that something wonderful could maybe put a pause on those crimes And, you know, what's more wonderful than the birth of a child? So then in May of 1986, the next and final victim that we know of was murdered. Her name was Janelle Cruz, and she was 18 years old. This took place in Irvine, California, and Joseph bound her, sexually assaulted her, as he did with the other victims, and then bludgeoned her to death. Not much is known about, you know, Joseph's life from that time to sometime in the late 90s, where he took on a job as, I believe, a mechanic at a Save Mart distribution center in Roseville, California, which is, you know, another suburb of Sacramento, a little bit east of Sacramento. And he would go on to work at the Save Mart distribution center till he retired in 2017. During this time, he lived in Citrus Heights and was married to Sharon, had 3 children. They did separate at some point, but stayed legally married. With this case, investigators, you know, all over California never gave up. There were not only investigators, but people in general that just wanted answers. They wanted to know who was responsible for these horrific crimes. And at one point, there was speculation that, you know, the Golden State Killer and the original Night Stalker, East Area Rapist, and the Visalia Ransacker were all one and the same. But that wouldn't take place until 2001, when DNA was tested and linked the East Area Rapist to the Golden State Killer or original Night Stalker. And then later, of course, Joseph would admit guilt to being the Visalia Ransacker. So from 2001 to 2016, I'm not sure how much took place on the case. Okay. In 2016, a task force was assembled to continue and kind of dive back into all these unsolved crimes and hopefully catch the individual responsible. And lo and behold, through DNA connection from one of the genealogy sites online, investigators were able to actually connect Joseph DeAngelo to the homicides through DNA. So somebody in his family had, you know, submitted DNA to one of the genealogy sites. When they ran the DNA from these crimes through the system, there was a match. And so from there, they had to kind of taper down and rule out individuals to find who actually was the one responsible. And when they zeroed in on Joseph, who many were pretty certain was the guy after finding out that he had been in the military and he had also served as a police officer at 2 different locations, because during these cases being unsolved, many speculated that he was either a police officer or military because of some of the things that took place, because of a boot print at one point outside of one of the victims' homes looked like military or police issued boots. The fact that he evaded them for over 40 years made people wonder, you know, what kind of training he had to be able to get away with this for so long. And a little ironic that he worked burglary unit, you know, when he was a police officer. It's like, for me, I feel like he chose his life path based around committing these crimes. I mean, why else would he want to be a police officer other than to be able to be right in on the investigations and know how police work and how they hunt and, you know, catch these types of criminals? Just my speculation. I could be full of shit, who knows? But once they zeroed in on Joseph, they then did a stakeout and eventually were able to obtain items from, I believe, his vehicle, outside of his vehicle handle, and trash, and they were able to test his DNA from those items against the DNA in the database, and lo and behold, it was a match. They finally had their fucking guy after over 40 years. At the time, he was living in Citrus Heights with one of his daughters and her daughter, his granddaughter. And they say he had a roast in the oven when they arrested him. He didn't make a stink. He didn't make a huge scene. He went willingly with the police officers to the police station. And something that I found to be a little bit weird is that when they put him in an interrogation room, you know, cameras are always running when they're interrogating you. And he would know that because he's a police officer, remember? he was caught on camera talking to himself, and I'm going to read quotes of what he said. Quote, "I did all that. I didn't have the strength to push him out. He made me. He went with me. It was like in my head. I mean, he's part of me. I didn't want to do those things. I pushed Jerry out and had a happy life. I did all those things. I destroyed all those lives. So now I've got to pay the price." Now, from what we know, from what we can gather of Joseph, he wasn't insane. He didn't have multiple personalities. I'm kind of going to speculate that that was his way of trying to hopefully get people to think he was crazy so he could claim insanity, but I could be wrong. And while in prison and attending court hearings and things like that, Joseph would be brought in a wheelchair, all fragile. He was 72 when he was arrested, and when he spoke, you could barely hear him. Old man that couldn't walk. But yet when video footage was shown of him in his cell, he was walking just fine. He would, proceed to climb up onto the bunk of his bed and put paper over lights to stay in the dark, I guess, showing, that he was, again, trying to manipulate. He, prior to being arrested, was still out tinkering in his garage. He would, he rode a motorcycle and would do tricks on his motorcycle, perfectly capable of getting around, perfectly capable of caring for himself. And then the instant he is arrested, he tries to act like he's, talking to this voice in his head, and then act like he's poor me, little fragile fucker in a wheelchair. But ultimately, on June 29th of 2018, Joseph took a plea deal and admitted guilt to 13 murders and over 50 sexual assaults, as well as dozens of home evasions, which would, tie him to the Visalia Ransacker. So he admitted guilt to these cases to avoid the death penalty, because ideally they couldn't actually charge him with a lot of the crimes that he committed, mainly the sexual assaults, because too much time had passed. And with the statute of limitations, they could not hold him accountable for those crimes. So they made a deal to spare his life if he would admit guilt, so that the families that he affected for over 40 years could get some sort of justice. On August 21st, 2020, after 3 full days of victim impact statements in the courtroom, which aired on many news stations, Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was convicted of 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. He received 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. I personally think there's many more victims out there. I don't feel like Joseph went from 1986 to 2018 and didn't commit another rape or murder. I mean, I know in history there have been, serial killers that have stopped their crimes, but it's not common. They might take a hiatus like he did for those 5 years, and maybe he did, I don't know. I just feel like for somebody so evil that just got off on taunting these poor victims and calling them and just committing these horrible acts against so many people, I just don't feel like he would just stop. I mean, shit, I could be wrong. I don't know. Let me know what you think. But I hope, my personal hope is that now that this is done, that all those victims, all the victims and the victims' families who are also victims, have some sort of closure, knowing that he can't hurt them again. He can't hurt anybody else again. Many of them stood up and spoke out during the victims' impact statements in the court. And they told him how they spoke about how he affected their lives, and many of the victims' families spoke out. And this fucker did so much damage to so many people, and I hope that now that they know that he's behind bars, that they can actually sleep. I mean, I can't imagine, and my heart goes out to these victims. And the reason that I so into telling the true crime stories and studying serial killers is because since I was young, I have wanted to understand and know why somebody does this. How can somebody hunt down and murder people with no motive, with no reason? It's like, from what I understand, it's almost like an addiction, like a craving. Like they can't get this, you know, it's an obsession. Maybe not an addiction and craving, maybe it's an obsession. I don't know. But, you know, many studies have shown that serial killers commonly are victims of abuse, neglect, trauma during their childhood. And some studies even connected, you know, injuries, head injuries and things like that with the trauma and neglect and abuse to, you know, what creates a serial killer. But ultimately we don't know. And for me, I've always been so curious because I want to know how and why. And I want to know how and why so that maybe someday it can be prevented. I mean, that's probably a long shot, you know, at least I hope you liked this, and let me know what you think